I again welcome everyone who is new to First United Methodist Church Plano. We're in the middle of a series that we started at the beginning of the month entitled Enough. Because as we sang, it finally is only the things that we do in Christ that really last, that are of significance, that bear real worth in our lives. We began 3 weeks ago, first of the month, talking about faith in the midst of financial crisis, where we said that sometimes it takes a crisis in order for us to reassess what finally is important and realigning our lives appropriately, that we choose differently in order to live with greater contentment and less anxiety. 2 weeks ago, we used the Proverbs to talk about wisdom and finance, because this series has been all about equipping us for our finances. We've given out tools in paper, on our website, budget outlines, resources, people, and classes to help us think thoughtfully about how we use our money, because God cares. God cares very much about how and where we spend our money. That's a challenge for all of us in this culture, because as Adam Hamilton, my colleague at Resurrection Church in Kansas City, says, we all suffered various degrees from these viruses. Affluenza, made easier by credititis, the ability to buy now and pay later, maybe, at an extraordinary cost. And last week we talked about RHS, or restless heart syndrome, where the thing we buy just doesn't really last very long in terms of satisfaction, and we're ready to go get the next new thing, thinking that fix will make the difference, only to find that it really just doesn't. It's a short-term contentment as compared to the long-term contentment that we just got done singing about. And we talked last week about how it is that if we interrupt some of those impulse buys and find out how much we spend eating out, that we actually have more of the very same money that we already have to simply use differently for the things that really do bring contentment. We talked about the young man in my previous church who 6 months after being laid off and before being offered another job, was the first-time father for a beautiful baby girl 3 months into his layoff, and so fell in love with this new child that he had a serious conversation with his wife, who was also, at that time, the only breadwinner for the family, and together they chose to downsize. They moved into a smaller house, sold a car, so that he could become a house dad. That was the contentment that they found in their life. Today, I want to build upon that in talking about being a people defined by generosity, with even the very same money that they have, especially in light of God's gift of Jesus Christ to all of us. This is the framework with which our writer is speaking to young Timothy, the right-hand person who is talking and working with the people in Ephesus, the church that Paul had founded. They're struggling with some of these same issues. Where are they going to place their faith? Where are they going to find their contentment? And so the writer is telling Timothy these things in 1 Timothy chapter 5 or 6. Tell people who are rich at this time not to become egotistical and not to place their hope on their finances, which are uncertain. Instead, they need to hope in God, who richly provides everything for our enjoyment. Tell them to do good, to be rich in the good things they do, to be generous and share with others. When they do these things, they will save a treasure for themselves that is a good foundation for the future. That way, they can take hold of what is truly life. One man who had to live a lot of life before he finally discovered what was truly life was Floyd Hamilton. You don't know that name. Floyd Hamilton hung with a couple of folks whose names, anyway, you do know. Bonnie and Clyde, about 100 years ago. When Bonnie and Clyde were the most notorious bank-robbing couple in all of North Texas, Floyd Hamilton ran with them. And they robbed bank after bank here in North Texas until finally Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down in a massive shootout with law enforcement officers. Floyd Hamilton was not there. He didn't learn his lesson. He kept robbing banks until he was Texas public enemy number 1. Before he was captured and stayed in jail for a long time. And unlike a lot of our expectations and experience of people who go into prisons for a long time, he actually came out reformed and would actually wind up working for the Huffines Auto Group as a security officer. And when he wasn't doing that, Floyd, who died in the 1980s, spent a lot of time going to civic groups and talking to church youth groups. And what he told all of them was this: the money I had was worthless because I wasn't free. What I needed most, money couldn't buy. That's what our writer is pointing to in this text, pointing out to his hearers that trusting in the richness of generous sharing so that we may take hold of life that is truly life. It's what Jesus meant when he said to his disciples and those listeners, I come that they might have life and have it abundantly. Today's fourth installment of Enough may have some of you saying quietly to yourselves, enough already. It's a stewardship campaign after all. The church needs our money. So we fill out some cards, we turn it in, the church builds its budget. We do it every year. And while there is certainly some truth to those endpoints of pragmatism, a layperson taught me a long time ago that those are not the starting points, nor are they the starting reasons why we do this work together. Bob Brody was our certified financial planner when Cammie and I first got married years ago. And we lived and served up the road at First United Methodist Church of Allen. Bob, first and foremost, though, an Air Force veteran, was a dedicated follower of Jesus Christ. Bob taught every disciple Bible study that was ever published. Bob was the office holder of every significant leadership position in our church. Bob was simply a model for a couple of young pastors of what living your faith looked like. One year, Cammie and I went on to start a new church from scratch, and it was important to us to leaven the loaf with an understanding of what generosity looks like. So I asked Bob, this layperson, friend, and CFP, to come and preach during an emphasis like this. And Bob said, I'll do that. He said, do you want to see my script before I preach it? And I said, no, I trust you. Just bring whatever you bring. I would find out why Bob asked me that question. About the third week of our emphasis, Bob came to our pulpit. And he began his sermon by saying, a lot of people think that we have stewardship campaigns because the church needs your money. And then he looked at everybody in the congregation and he glanced at me with a smile before saying, the church doesn't need your money. He said, if all of you were to stop giving today and they had to close the doors of the church, you'd find another church to go worship. The Church of Jesus Christ would continue, with or without this United Methodist Church. And then he said, and the pastor doesn't need your money. And then he went on to explain. He said, Cammie and Matt are ordained United Methodist pastors. They're not hired by you, they're appointed to you. And if this church were to close, the bishop would simply appoint them to other churches in other places. And then Bob said, and the church, and God doesn't need you to be having a campaign because God doesn't need your money. He said, God who made heaven and earth has everything God needs. He said, no, so why do we have a stewardship campaign to become more generous in our giving? If the church doesn't need you to do that, the pastor doesn't need you to do that, God doesn't need the money, then why do we have campaigns to become more generous? He said, because we need to be more generous for our own soul's sake. From our beginning, from our creation, in the eyes of God, we were all, and we all do, continue to yearn for the life that is really life, life abundant, as Jesus said. A life that, while clinging to the things that we think will give us life when they don't, what that tells us is that clinging is the surest hindrance to our discovering that abundant life. And that the opposite of clinging is letting go. It's why the writer encouraged the early church to be rich in good works, in generosity and a readiness to share. The writer, prophet Malachi says in chapter 3, verse 10, God speaking through the prophet, test me. Test me, God dares. And see if whether I do not open all the windows of heaven for you and empty out a blessing until there is enough. As a Christian first, and as our certified financial planner, Bob challenged Cammie and me to be generous back to God, to be generous to ourselves, and to be generous to others just about the time that we had gotten married, had our first 800 square foot apartment, had our first 2 jobs as full-time pastors after having just graduated from graduate school and a few bills. There we were, and Bob is challenging us on how to begin our life as pastors, but more importantly, how to begin our life as stewards. He taught me what I now call the Rohde rules, the Bob Rohde rules. And I have been repeating those rules to every couple that I have ever counseled since then, because I want every couple that I marry to have life abundant as a married couple. And I turned to Kelly and Carl, who were sitting right there this morning, Deborah, where you are, and I said, didn't I tell you all that over the counseling session? They go, yeah, you did. It's true, because I think it's just that important. Bob challenged Cammie and I 35 years ago to be generous back to God with the biblical tithe. That means our first fruits. That means 10%. Gross or net, you make the call. We couldn't do that immediately as a brand new married couple. So Bob suggested that we start wherever we were in our giving and increase that 1% per year until we moved up to the tithe. Whatever we've been giving the last year, give 1 more percent, he said. And increase that until you get to the goal that you know you want to be at. So we started at 4%. Because that's what we felt we could give at the time, and we worked up 1% per year until we reached the tithe. Most of us, I think, want to think of ourselves as generous to God, generous to our futures, meaning our ultimate retirements that I spoke about some weeks ago in a sermon. And Bob was clear about that too, because the second roadie rule was build each year by 1%, whatever it is you're putting away for your retirement, until you get to, again, the tithe, or 10%. Over and above whatever your pension plan might be, your 401k, 10% of your income goes to that. Now, 35 years later, most certified financial planners would say that really needs to be closer to 15% because of the way pension plans have gone in the last 30 years. He said, you take that off the top along with your tithe, and he said, then you learn to live on the rest. And when you start off as a young couple and you're looking at 10 to 20% right off the top to God and to your future, you're automatically living more simply. And so we did. Cammie and I gulped, but we took on those challenges as newly minted pastors. But because we believe in God and we believe Bob, we went ahead, wondering how we would pay for everything else as newlyweds. But you know, we never missed a meal. We ate in a lot in our 800 square foot apartment. And when we did go out to eat, it was a treat. It was a date. It was really special to go to La Madeleine. That was a big night out for us. And you know, we found a contentment in living that simplicity, and we found a contentment living on less things but spending more time playing games with the people who meant the most to us over a home-prepared meal. Simpler simply meant more time with others and less time with stuff. More time for contentment and joy. I think Winston Churchill was right when he said, we make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. The decision to simplify one's life generates simplicity. The decision to be generous generates generosity. If you've been following Adam Hamilton, our friend and peer's work in the Sunday school class, you know that he tells a story about Jeff Hansen. Jeff Hansen, back in 2007, was a 15-year-old son or student at the Kansas School for the Blind. Jeff was visually impaired due to an optic nerve tumor behind his eye that was caused by a genetic defect called neurofibromatosis. With chemo and treatments ongoingly, Jeff was able to see the large E on the optometrist's eye chart, and that was it. Nonetheless, Jeff took up, of all things, painting. Watercolors at first, and then acrylics on canvas, and began to create some really beautiful prints that would go onto greeting cards that he would then sell, and all of the proceeds would go to the Children's Tumor Foundation that he and his family had begun. As a 15-year-old, by 2007, he had raised $15,000 for the Children's Tumor Foundation, and he won a wish, his wish, from the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And his wish was to meet Elton John. And so after the concert there in Kansas City, he was whisked behind the doors and met Elton John, to whom he presented a $1,000 check to Elton John that he had raised from the prints that he had sold to go to Elton John's AIDS Research Foundation. And Elton John was so touched by that a week later, Jeff, the 15-year-old, receives a $5,000 check from Elton John for his Tumor Foundation for Children, and an invitation for an all-expense-paid trip for he and his family to come to Dubai for a second Elton John concert. The follow-up to that story from 15 years ago is that in 2020, Jeff Hansen died in Kansas City. He was 27 years old because another tumor had developed in his brain associated with the neurofibromatosis. But by this time, Jeff's paintings and his cards now hung in the homes of not only Elton John, but also Dale Earnhardt Jr., Warren Buffett, Billy Joel, and John Cena. To date, and it's been 4 years since his death, $8.5 million have been raised not only for the Children's Tumor Foundation, but also 200 other nonprofit organizations to which his work had been donated for them to raise money for good in the communities where they serve. The decision to be generous generates generosity. Next week, we are all going to have the opportunity, those of us in the house, all of you across the country who support the ministries of First United Methodist Church will have the opportunity to either electronically or on paper fill out this estimate of giving card to declare for yourself first and foremost what it is you want to thank God with in terms of your giving. We're going to have children who are standing on the floor. They'll have a huge basket, and we'll all have the opportunity to prayerfully come by, stay at the prayer rail as long as we need before putting our estimate of giving card into the basket. Why? Because that's what this is. First and foremost, Bob would say, this is a prayer of thanksgiving back to God for what God has generously poured into our lives. As I look to 2025, Cammie and I will cut a few expenses and use some of the same money we would have used for things that we forgot in order to increase our tithe to 11%, because we love God and we love this church and we love the difference that we're making in the community because of the love we have for our community. The question for all of us to prayerfully consider, all who love God and who love this church and her work, is simply, God, where would you have me? Where would you want me in my giving for the life that is really life? In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen.